Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Monday edition of the Sports Forecasters. Last week we ran into some illnesses, some technical difficulties, so we didn't get out on Friday like we normally do, but I wanted to get out a shorter episode this week in lieu of the NBA play-in tournament. This will be year two of the play-in tournament. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few picks on a few of the games, get my logic behind them, and we're going to roll with it from there. And then we'll have our regular episode this week on Friday. So you get a 2-for-1 this week since last week I dropped the ball. So to start things off, we're going to look at the play-in tournament. We're just going to go in order of when the games show up, not necessarily the time order, but the order by the date that it happened. So without further ado, we're going to look at the Eastern Conference play-in tournament matchup of our 7th and 8th seed. The Brooklyn Nets play host to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Cleveland Cavaliers have been a good story this season of becoming one of the worst teams in the last NBA season to one of the better teams, and for much of this season, one of the top 5 teams in the Eastern Conference. Towards the end, they slipped down quite a bit to be at the 8th seed. They started off strong in the season, but usually when you're a young team, it's hard to keep that kind of momentum throughout the season. With minimal veteran presence on the team, it just didn't translate to them staying above the play-in tournament. Brooklyn Nets, their descent into the play-in tournament is not surprising considering Kyrie, for the majority of the season, could not play at home games. Kevin Durant had an injury, his knee sprain, for much of the season. And then, for me, a baffling trade of dealing away James Harden. But in reality, when you look at James Harden, if the man's unhappy of being there, he will not play well for you. So moving him was a must. They had to. Unfortunately, they have not won that trade up to this point with Ben Simmons yet to play, and he's not going to play in this game. But let's look at the matchup itself. So, throughout the regular season, the Nets went 3-1 against the Cavs earlier. Last time they met was actually this past Friday, where the Nets beat the Cavs 118 to 107. When the Cavs beat the Nets during this series, it was when Kyrie and KD were not playing. Kyrie, because it was a home game for Brooklyn, could not play because of the vaccine mandate, and then KD just recently suffering his knee sprain. So, what are we looking at for this matchup? Well, we have first Jarrett Allen is confirmed to be out in this, so huge blow to the Cavs, something they needed. They needed that presence down low, that gritty presence down low. Without Jarrett Allen, that seems to be a piece that will cost them dearly. And I see the Nets winning this game. The spread's at 8.5 in the Nets' favor, and I think the Nets cover. I think the Nets win at least by 9, if not by 10. They're just going to cover this. They're going to take control of this game early and put the Cavs into an offensive rhythm they don't want to be in. KD and Kyrie want to take care of business early and soon to get themselves ready for the playoff matchup when they go against the number 2 seed in a rematch against the Bucks. So I say the Nets stamp their ticket in the playoffs on Tuesday night and move on to face the Bucks. On the Western Conference side, we have the Clippers versus the Timberwolves. Now, this one's a very close matchup. The spread has it at -3, but that's not what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at the over/under of 230. But before I get to that, during the regular season, they were split in their meetings. With that being a draw, I wanted to look at what team had the best momentum coming in to this play-in tournament. When you look at the Timberwolves, they are a huge surprise. They were the bottom of the Western Conference. I want to say the sixth worst team, sixth from the bottom last season, and now they find themselves being the seventh seed in the Western Conference. So hats off to the Timberwolves for turning the franchise around. Carl Anthony Towns was able to flourish this season with his teammates, but the Clippers have been very scrappy, and they were a team I was okay with before the season started. I thought they would be just like that team skimming at the 8th spot when the season first began, and I went away from that because it just didn't look good for them, but they end up being the 8th spot nonetheless. So should have stuck to my guns on that one. The Clippers have been this team that have been more on the rise. With the Clippers and Timberwolves, out of the last 6 games, Timberwolves have won 3 out of their last 6, while Clippers have won 5 out of their last 6. So Clippers have great momentum coming in. They've been resting Paul George. He's only been able to play a handful of games this season, but because this game is only one game, I think the Clippers end up winning this. Timberwolves are the young team. They're not as experienced in dealing with the playoff pressure, so I think for this round, this matchup, they fall a bit short, and the Clippers end up winning this. But I'm not going to go by the point spread of 3. I'm going to go with the over/under of 230 points. I think it's going to be under 230 points during the regular season. Two of the games were under 230, and I think in a playoff matchup, defense becomes more heightened. So I think 230 is way too high, and I'm going to go under that 230 for the Clippers to win that 7-8 matchup, and they stamp their ticket into the playoffs. Now moving on to our Wednesday matchups. In our Wednesday matchups, we have the Hornets versus Hawks. Hornets versus Hawks has a -4.5 going in the Hawks' favor coming into this one-game playoff series. During the regular season, they split 2 games apiece, with it just alternating. One time the home team wins, one time the away team wins, and so on and so forth. So there's no real decisive matchup going into this. So for me, what I looked at is the experience and really the star power that drives your team. For the Hornets, they have been a good story, but I think the Hawks, with that great playoff push they made and just how much better they've looked in March and how much stronger they looked in March, I really feel more strongly about them winning it. Again, I'm going to go with the over under on this one because I don't feel too strongly about the 4.5. Over unders at 236.5 points, and I think it's going to be under. I think the Hawks get the Hornets uncomfortable very quickly. They go on their offensive runs, but then they suffocate the Hornets defensively, even though neither team's great defensively. The Hawks do tend to have their moments of where they can get you into bad stretches, and I think that shows up here in this game. So I have the Hawks winning, but the over under is what I would look at for a betting prospect with them going under 236.5 points. Moving on to our last of the 10-9 matchups on the Western Conference side. This time we have the Spurs versus the Pelicans. And for this one, with the Spurs versus Pelicans, a lot of new faces for the bottom of our play-in tournaments here, different names, different teams than the season before. So for the Spurs versus Pelicans, during the regular season, the Spurs led the series 3-1. And the big thing I'm looking at to pick the Spurs to win here is the fact that the Spurs are the number 2 team in defensive rating and 14th offensively, where the Pelicans are just middle of the road, 16th and 12th. Middle of the road is not going to help you excel. If this was a playoff series, I'd be very confident that the Spurs would end up winning it. With it being a one game, I'm still going to stick with the Spurs. I think Pop's going to roll out a good game plan. They're going to have the right assignments. They're going to have the right matchups for them to be able to win this. I don't feel too strongly about the -5, but the over-unders at 229.5 points. I think it's going to be well under that 229. It's not going to be much over 110 for either team if they get to that. I think they're going to be well under 110, the losing team, and the winning team will be just barely over 110 if that's the case. So go under the 229.5. So in terms of people stamping themselves in the playoffs, I have the Nets and Clippers. Now, looking at our last matchups to make that final push for the 8th seed in their respective conference. First, I have the Cavs versus the Hawks, with the Hawks visiting the Cavs, and then I have the Spurs visiting the Timberwolves. And so what I'm looking here is much like I said for the Hawks beating the Hornets, I think the Hawks beat the Cavs. Cavs had a great start this season. I just think that rookie presence is just going to bite them in the tail with the lack of playoff experience amongst the entire team or enough veteran experience to kind of push them through that over what the Hawks were able to accomplish a season ago. I think the Hawks just lock in and end up knocking the Cavs out, and they earn the 8th seed going against the Miami Heat. Bouncing over the Spurs and Timberwolves. Timberwolves have had difficulty these last few weeks of the season. They're very up and down, back and forth, but I think the Clippers' loss will wake them up, and they'll do just enough to get past the Spurs, so I think Timberwolves advance. For the Eastern Conference, I have Nets as the 7th seed. I have the Hawks as the 8th seed. Then for the Western Conference, I have the Clippers as the 7th seed and the Timberwolves as the 8th seed. We'll see how those all shake out when we come back. When we come back with our next episode coming out this Friday, looking at the playoffs, picking those matchups for the playoffs, as well as making some Major League Baseball projections. Tune in for that episode. Thank you so much for tuning into this quick episode, looking at the NBA play-in tournament and seeing where I think some things are going to go. Again, I only looked at the spread for those first round games because right now they don't have spreads for those next games. And by the time the next episode comes out, those play-in tournament games will be pretty well concluded. So thank you for listening to the Sports Forecasters. I'm Nick Alvarez, and I'll see you next time.